Welcome back. So with this video, we'll do a debrief of value chain integration. Again, we'll pick up on some of the discussions we had in class and push things forward a little bit. In class, we talked about the role that value chain integration plays in Apple's success. And clearly, that's a major part. And we use this analogy. Do we think of VCI as a parasite, or instead, do we think of it as symbiosis? And clearly, from my point of view, value chain integration is a symbiotic process. Now, there are winners. In this case, the alligator is a lot bigger than the birds, but they both feed off each other. And there's two sets of questions if you're thinking about an effective value chain integration strategy. First question is configuration. What do you build? What do you borrow? What do you buy? Which activities should we participate in internally, and which should we do externally? And again, that's a choice. Long value chain, in this simplified case, all the way from research through service. Not everybody does everything. We need to make the choice around which parts we do, possibly, for instance, this set. And once we've decided where we want to be, do we do it internally or do we do it externally? And then, if we go externally, or for the parts that we go externally, who will be our key partners? And then the second question is coordination. Once we know where the configuration is, what we're going to do internally, what we're going to do externally with partners, how do we coordinate it? How do we manage our relationships with our value chain partners, and in many cases, with their partners? So first order coordination and second order coordination. And if we think about Apple, and again, we used this slide in class, Apple is highly visible with its design combinations, and it has this underlying driver of world-class build, borrow, buy strategy and world-class value chain integration. And as we looked at the Gartner ratings as number one from 2008 to 2014, and its own masterclass from 2015 on. And the building blocks for that strategy are the build, borrow, buy, mixing internal and external sourcing, and value chain integration, figuring out what the configuration would look like, and then being effective at coordinating. And we talked about the build, borrow, buy strategy, where the general strategy is deciding what to do internally, where to do contracting, where to do alliances, where to do acquisitions, typically thinking it through in that order, going internal when it makes sense. If we can't, going through considering contracting. If it's too complicated for that, thinking about alliances. If it's too complicated for that, considering acquisitions. And at Apple, we had the architectural design for internal development. We had basic components for contracting, with things like more complex components, like the screens for alliances, and then the things that fit in closely as acquisitions, where it needed an integration map and understood the motivation of the people that it was coming with the targets and the people that were inside Apple. And again, another slide that we used in class. The value chain here runs from design through customers, development and launch activities, sourcing, delivery, and return activities. A lot of complicated set of choices to make for configuration. Where do we want to participate? And then which to do internally and which to do externally. And Apple, in the green, is doing a big chunk of the design itself, some of the components itself, like some of the chips. It's doing some of the retailing itself, some of the marketing itself, much of the marketing itself, but not all. But outsourcing most of the assembly, most or all of the assembly, and outsourcing carriers. And outsourcing a big chunk of components, actually outsourcing some of the design, much of the retail, and some of the marketing. And of course, one of its major partners is Foxconn, which is acting as a value chain partner of VCP in the component and assembly stage. And just with this slide, to reinforce the discussion we had in class, that there's often two suppliers, sometimes only one, but often two or even more, so that it isn't held up by one supplier. And sometimes those suppliers are serious competitors, like Samsung. So a value chain integration strategy often means learning how to work effectively in partnership with a company that you're also competing with. If that firm, the competitor, happens to have the best QCI, QCT combination in the world, quality, timeliness, cost. Let me just, there's some research that my colleagues, friends Pierre Dussoge and Bernard Garrett did on alliances in Europe. And these are alliances in a particular context, so the numbers we're going to show in a moment won't be the same in every context, but the general trend is true. And they asked the question, are alliances between rivals more or less common than alliances among non-competing firms? In their data, the short answer is many of the alliances are between rivals. And again, these are in Europe during a consolidation period. But in many industries, this will be true because the skills you need are often going to be held by firms you're also competing with. So just as Apple's having to partner with a major competitor, Samsung, in many cases, each of us is going to have to be allying with competitors. And this is life sciences. And here, these are data that I drew together from Recap, asking, who's doing the alliances? Is it the big firms, the big pharma, the big medtech firms? Is it big firms partnering with universities? Is it smaller firms, biological firms, smaller, earlier stage medtech firms partnering with the established firms? Is it the smaller firms partnering with universities, or is it small firms partnering with small firms? The red are data over the 6 or 7 years from 1995 through 2001. And then the blue is from 2010 through 2016, and this says 2001. It should actually say, I think it's 2000. It should actually say 2009 because they're contiguous periods. And the patterns are similar but accentuating over time, and so especially if we look at the last 7 years or so, the 2010 through 2016 period. Massive number of alliances between small firms and small firms. Firms that are often competing with each other, but also having to partner in order both for technology and marketing. Lots of alliances between small firms and universities. The process by which science comes out of the lab into startups. Some alliances with small firms and large firms, not nearly as many as the other two. A few alliances, not very many, between universities and large firms, and a few between large firms and large firms, competitors in this space. So lots and lots of alliances, especially small firm to small firm. Small firms competing with each other to create markets, and also having to cooperate in order to build their own businesses. So competitors down here, and lots of competitors up here, and potential competitors there. So the short answer is, do firms ally with competitors? Boy, do they ever. Now, Apple, we looked at the value capture slide. I won't belabor this. The key point, of course, is Apple makes a lot of the money out of the value chain. And these data come from the case. We didn't talk about them in class, but they are in the case. And if we look at Apple versus Nokia, Apple with the iPhone and a few models, Nokia with 220 handsets. Apple with a life cycle of 2 to 3 years, Nokia with a life cycle of 5 to 6 years. Apple with a couple of hundred suppliers, Nokia taking deep pride in the fact that it has thousands of suppliers. And I love this picture of Nokia's handsets from 1982 to 2006. As a graphic, it's wonderful. As a strategy, it's got something left to be desired, because the market gets confused, internal gets distributors get confused, telecom carriers get confused. This is a lot to keep track of. Then there's the data I had on adding and subtracting. Adding capabilities, subtracting capabilities. And this is Nokia. And the key point here is that Nokia kept adding. But while it was adding, it rarely got rid of anything. And so what you end up getting is lots of cool stuff new, but lots of old stuff that's messing up the place that confuses what you're trying to do with the new. And Apple originally looked like that. And then when Jobs came back, one of the things that Steve did was say, we're going to keep adding things. So just as Nokia is adding things, so is Apple, but we're also going to get rid of things. And that's a critically important point, that you can't just add things. You've got to get rid of old capabilities that you no longer need and are going to get in the way. We talked about the savings. I just want to underline the point that some of the savings come from inventory savings. In this case, my estimate of $346 million because of more rapid turnover. And a massive amount of the savings in this case comes because of more control through the value chain integration strategy, and as a result, lower costs in direct costs and manufacturing costs. And a simple estimate here is that this is a $12 billion savings. So a nice big chunk of change for inventory and a huge chunk of change for having greater control and discipline in the supply chain and in the value chain overall. Apple's financials, just to reinforce the point around how successful this company has been. Gradual growth in sales, and then the kink, and this really is about the time that Tim Cook came on board, just absolute takeoff. It goes up and down from time to time, but boy, it's taken off. A few trends. The blue is cost of goods sold, coming down over time, flat the last few years, but substantial discipline. And if it stayed up here at 85% rather than coming down to 60, that's a lot of money left on the table. I mean, this is where a huge proportion of Apple's profits are coming. The red is SG&A, selling costs, lots of money in total, but as a percentage of sales, they've been able to bring it down. R&D, also down a bit, up the last few years. So even as their sales have gone up the last few years, and we see that up here, they've continued to keep pace with R&D, in fact, even keep more than pace with R&D. And then we look at return on sales, peaked around 2012, down ever so slightly the last couple of years, but this is flat at 21% return on sales for multiple years in a row. Really strong evidence of success. And then, of course, this is the stock market. And this is Apple compared to Nokia and the Dow. And you can just barely see the Dow and the Nokia and Nokia down there. For a little bit of the dive the last few months, but this is pretty amazing. This is just absolutely amazing trend in stock. And again, Dow and the Nokia just hidden down here near the baseline. So let's talk a little bit about this transition from what used to be a make to buy strategy to what we now call value chain integration. And once upon a time in the value chain, the emphasis was on build. I mean, you outsourced simple stuff. You outsourced things that where somebody else could get big economies of scale. But if it was all specialized, you tended to do it inside, and do that for two reasons. One is you wanted to avoid holdup with suppliers, avoid having them take advantage of you because you were trapped with them buying specialized components, specialized products from them. And the other was to manage complex activities because it's much easier historically to manage those within a firm than across the boundaries of independent companies. So again, traditional strategy was contract out for commodities, and if something was specialized, either do it as an internal project or an acquisition, but bring it inside the company. That's changing rapidly. Today, increasingly in industry after industry, rather than make or buy, the decision is make, buy, or partner, and then manage the partnerships in the value chain. Lots of sectors, whether it's auto, aerospace, phones, agriculture, athletic gear, life sciences, the leaders are much more making that tripartite choice. What do we buy? What do we make? What do we partner? And not just individual discrete partnerships, but how do we partner? How do we manage? How do we coordinate the overall portfolio of partnerships that we have in place? And again, I'll remind us of this definition of a value chain integrator. It's an actor, a firm that coordinates multiple independent enterprises to define and deliver customer value. To define what the customer value is going to be, and then make sure it gets delivered. And those are critically important. The define point matters. Value chain integrator has the vision of value, and then to make sure it gets delivered. Coordinate the other actors in the value chain, coordinate its own activities to make sure we get to the value that we've defined. And just a reminder, in healthcare, this is the Gartner Top 25 in the healthcare supply chain over the last few years. Some very visible players as healthcare providers, and equally some very visible players as life science companies. Companies that we recognize in part because and much of their strength comes from their ability to manage the value chain, supply chain, and then the overall value chain. So today, today's strategy is this really very much this combination of VCI, value chain integration strategy, and VCP, value chain partner strategy. And there's a lot of money to be made in both of those places. I mean, ideally, it's great to be a value chain integrator. But by definition, any industry only has a small number of those. Not everybody's going to be able to be there. You may be able to build up there over time, but in the midterm, if you can't be a VCI, there's often value chain partner strategies at some point within the value chain. Where the value chain integrator coordinates the overall system, and the partners coordinate subsets of the value chain system. Apple in our example being the VCI, and Foxconn being the VCP, coordinating the series the component manufacturers that come into assembly. Another example, this is value chain integration at Nike. 2017, Nike was outsourcing to 41 countries. It was outsourcing to suppliers that had slightly over a million people. Nike itself had 74,000 internal staff. So, million outside, 74 inside in 41 countries. And Nike went from being pretty good at this to extremely good at this. 2009, 2014, 2017 went from 1,000 suppliers to 715 supplier factories to just over 500 supplier factories. So huge emphasis on external supply, but really tightening down on how many suppliers, how many factories it was working with. Heavy emphasis on training. It has a center in Vietnam and another center in Sri Lanka. And built starting in 2004, pushing forward through 2009, and by 2011, 80% of the suppliers it was dealing with were involved in supplier training. And Nike gave them the option of being involved in the training, but it wasn't a real option. I mean, the option was be involved in the training or don't supply Nike. So it's a really simple choice for the suppliers. And once they got there, there's really strong pressure to share best practices. So rather than purely competing with each other, if you want to deal with Nike, if you want to be a partner with Nike, you have to share your best practices across other suppliers. And what's really interesting is to look at this both in terms of the quality of the products and the working conditions. And one of my colleagues did a study, Greg Distelhorst did a study inside Nike to look at supplier relationships and looked at the quality of the products and the cost of the products that it was producing, and looked at the working conditions for the employees, satisfaction and safety. And the intriguing thing was that the better Nike was at getting quality from its suppliers, it was also helping them improve working conditions. These things were actually a win-win. And over this time, within Gartner, the overall Gartner supply chain rankings, Nike went from good, number 21 in 2005, to very good, number 6 in 2018. Still a few that Gartner ranks ahead of it, but a steady move up. Good for its profitability. This is both return on sales and return on assets. A little bit of a bump in 1998, 1999, but then pretty steady growth since then. And very good for the stock market. Nike's in black. Little bit of ebb and flow, a little bit of a roller coaster, but a lot higher than the blue, which is Adidas, and a lot higher than the Dow average, which is the orange. A lot of value created over this period from 2001 on. Another example inside life sciences. This is Eli Lilly, which went from an emphasis on internal development at Lilly Research Labs, LRL in Indianapolis, to a much bigger emphasis on using alliances. And these are some data from alliances from Recap on Lilly's use of alliances and contracts. 1981, 1982, 1983, barely any, to when Randall Tobias was in as CEO, developed a strategy of much more emphasis on using alliances. Also acquisitions, going from very few acquisitions to a lot more. So a much more sophisticated build, borrow, buy strategy than it had historically, where it had an emphasis on build, to now both build, both buy and borrow. And there's a really interesting correlation here. As the cost of goods sold has gone down, that's the blue line, and the cost of goods sold has gone down in part because of the greater reliance on alliances for development, alliances for contract manufacturing, operating income has gone up. It's not an identity. The correlation is 0.45, but there's certainly enough there that the more discipline you have, the more you can control your costs, the more you can control your quality through the supply chain, through the value chain, the better able you are to generate profits. Now let me talk a little bit about value chain partners. And again, it's great to be a VCI. Not everybody can be. If you can't position yourself as a VCI, think hard about whether you can be a VCP, a value chain partner. And let's think of some examples. Consumer electronics, Foxconn, which we've already seen, Celestica here in Toronto, Flextronics in Singapore. In auto, companies like Bosch and Magna and Johnson Controls. In life sciences, IQVIA, which used to be Quintiles until I bought IMS and are now IQVIA. McKesson, Medline and Kai-Hai. CCRM, which we visited. And in medical services, surgical services allocations providers, Baycrest, Sick Kids International, who you visited, many of the PBMs, CVS Caremark, Optum RX, Express Scripts. Companies that are positioning themselves as partners, value chain partners, and in some cases, trying to move up and become value chain integrators. And PBMs, as we talk about in class, are certainly an example of that, as pushing themselves forward to be the integrators. Foxconn, back up in consumer electronics, is also pushing itself forward to try to take on some integration roles. And think about some of the pieces of a value chain partner strategy. And I'll use the Foxconn example. Foxconn does assembly. It also coordinates suppliers. And its suppliers are often clustered around its campuses. Its campuses in Brazil, its campuses in Wisconsin, its campuses in China, its multiple campuses in China, typically near Shenzhen, its campuses in the Czech Republic. Basically very similar to a VCI, but focused on a subset of the activities, and typically working within the vision of the VCI to help the VCI deliver its vision, rather than generating the vision of customer value. Foxconn has, depending on how you count, somewhere between 800,000 employees and 1.2 million employees. I've seen different estimates. 40% of them have less than a high school education. It has 12 facilities in China, 7 in Malaysia, 5 in Brazil, 4 in Eastern Europe, 3 in Mexico. It's got 1 in Japan through its acquisition of Sharp. It's got 1 in Korea. It's got 1 in the US in Wisconsin. And it had 1 in India, in Chennai, which it shut down. It just didn't work out there for whatever reason. Then this customer base is highly differentiated across customers. These are almost all in consumer electronics of one form or another, but lots of variety in here, from Acer through to Xiaomi. And then very, very active, very, very skilled at supplier coordination. Several hundred suppliers, often co-located, as I said, with its campuses, Foxconn taking the lead, and Apple being engaged for the suppliers that are relevant for Apple. So even as good as Foxconn is, and as much as a lead it takes, Apple is also very hands-on with the Foxconn suppliers. Then we look at Foxconn financials. Its revenue has grown, up, flat, up again. Return on sales has come down, actually, although it's been flat the last few years. There's a few years there where it was really riding the Apple wave, which is great for profitability, but was really risky because it was relying just on one customer. Now it's at a stable rate, but much bigger, at a stable, lower but meaningful rate of profitability. You could look at R&D and selling expense, and here it's worth comparing Foxconn as a value chain partner to Apple as a value chain integrator. Apple in the dotted lines, Foxconn in the solid lines. If we look at SG&A, the blue, we've got Apple up here and Foxconn down here. Let me make sure that we've got that here. Yes, exactly. Apple here and Foxconn down here. Apple having a lot more marketing expense than Foxconn. And similarly with R&D. Foxconn having some R&D, but quite low. Apple having substantially more R&D. So in this case, at least, Apple's taking the lead on the marketing and the R&D, and Foxconn is taking the lead on the production. In fact, if we look at cost of goods sold as a percentage, Foxconn is much higher than Apple. Apple's been able to bring it down. Foxconn has had to take that on as the partner. And that, of course, if we look at the growth in cost of goods sold for Foxconn, track that with the lower return on sales, that correlation is frankly causal as well as correlated. Foxconn's the black here. Apple again the blue. Dow Jones way down here. Foxconn substantially better than the Dow, but nowhere near Apple. So typically, not always, but typically a value chain partner strategy will be less profitable than a really successful VCI. Then it's worth looking at Foxconn and life sciences. In 2015, they had a goal of generating $200 million in revenue from medical devices by 2020, by next year. And basically, they're looking at the consumer electronics business, seeing opportunities to scale out of that and build off of that and move into medtech, into medical devices. Some examples of the activity. In 2011, they invested in a smartwatch maker, Wim Labs, which Google later bought. 2013, they released their own smartwatch with a health and a fitness center. Didn't go much of anywhere, but it was an attempt to move into that space. 2014, they took a stake in a vital signs monitoring company, Sotera, in San Diego. Also 2014, they put $5 million into a hearing device company, smartphone-enabled hearing device company called SoundHawk. 2017, they went into a partnership at the University of Wisconsin Carbone Cancer Center to identify ways to diagnose and treat cancer patients. In 2018, last year, also in Wisconsin, they've got a data venture with Advocate Aurora Health. So continuing investment, moving into life sciences, partly as a value chain partner, continuing the value chain partner strategy, but testing the waters to see whether they can conceivably be the value chain integrator. Now I just want to reinforce the volatility. And now the volatility between a VCI versus a VCP versus the firms that are stuck out there on the periphery. And so here's the Apple value chain. Apple is the VCI, Foxconn is the VCP with multiple clients, and then the peripheral firms. And what we've got is Apple being much more stable, Foxconn being, reliably stable. It's the black line. Apple is the where's Apple? Apple's the gray line in there. Foxconn and Apple being much more stable, and much more volatility in the supplier firms. The market loves it when they get an Apple contract, and then they get really nervous when Apple starts to run into a bit of problems in the market, in the customer market, and the stock market gets worried about the suppliers that have a heavy dose of Apple in their product lines. Some companies like Cirrus with 82% of its sales being with Apple. Now take that into life sciences. GlaxoSmithKline is a VCI, and Express Scripts is an example of a VCP. And Express Scripts, which has just been purchased by Aetna and is now part of an insurance Express Scripts combination. But while it was a standalone company, it looked like this. We've got Glaxo being much more stable, Express Scripts a lot more volatility. And some of that growth, the last little bit, is because of thoughts because of expectations about it being purchased as part and cashing out. But some of that is because of the market sort of having some encouragement about the idea that Express Scripts as a pharmaceutical benefit management company, the PBM, might be moving into a position where it's controlling more of the value chain than it had historically. Now there's a question that we need to ask, which is, we've said that a VCI is better off if it only does what it needs to do internally and manages external partnerships for everything else. But that leaves the question of, when should it go internal? And in my mind, there's the two criteria that we talked about in class. One, there's a complex interface. That the product, the service that it brings inside needs specialized assets and skills, and it needs to be complexly linked together with other parts of the value chain. It's really hard to manage those. It's often hard to manage those across boundaries. And at the same time, and again we talked about this in class. Come back to this slide. And at the same time, it needs to be a credible case that it is the QCT leader. A combination of quality, cost, and timeliness. If not, it has two choices. Either it finds a way to become the QCT leader, or it looks outside, finds the QCT leader externally, and does a really good job coordinating on this complex interface. And complex is often easier to manage inside, but it's a bad idea to manage a poor product internally because of the complexity. We talked about this third criterion, when it's my job, and then there's a temptation, especially when it's my job, to say, of course we should do this internally. But that's a trap that we need to get out of. And if you can't make the case that it's both complex and you have high skill, do it outside. Basic supply chain, basic commodities, that's straightforward. Complex supply chain management, find the world leading suppliers of the specialized components and make sure you coordinate it effectively. And I want to come back to the notion of vertical integration. I really try to spend this slide developing the notion of vertical integration. And vertical integration is the idea that we got one stage of development, a second stage, and then say a third stage. And some examples of that be like semiconductor chips being put into handsets and then being sold by operators and or broadcast through operators. Or if you think about media, there's content creation and then media sales and then broadcast. Or in healthcare services, you've got primary, secondary care, tertiary care, and follow-up care. Or in pharma, you've got discovery, then trials, and formulation. Different stages that build vertically from one step to the other. And I'm just made up some numbers and said the value add at this stage is 8, at that stage is 2, and at that stage is 12. And again, these numbers are just made up. Now, the vertical integration question, and here I'm just going to focus on two stages. So let's take stage 1 and stage 2. Does the value of S1 plus S2 change if you have one owner versus two owners, right? So if you've got one owner, you've combined both of these things within one company. Does that have a different value than if you have two owners where one hands it off to the other? And sometimes 8 plus 2 is just 10. Other times, though, you can take 8 plus 2, and if you bring it inside one company, you get this red line where you can actually destroy value. If it's independent, it's 8. If it's independent, it's 2. You put it together, and it's 9, or sometimes even worse. Although in some cases, you get the green line. You put the two things together, 8 plus 2 can actually be worth more than 10, 11, 12, whatever it is. So the question is, when does the negative value happen, and when does the positive value happen? When do we get the red? When do we get the green? So let's think about the red. And the red is actually pretty common. And sometimes, if specialists know more, if you put them together, you often lose some of the specialization skills, some of the specialized knowledge. It can add to cost. You lose differentiation. You lose innovation opportunities because you take the focus away from what the specialist knows and try to pull them together into one general firm. Sometimes it's a question of weakness. You can be trapped by the internal supplier. Just because you've got something inside doesn't mean you always have control. Sometimes you're trapped by it. The company tells you to buy from your internal division whether or not it's better. Sometimes, frankly, it's worse. And you can get trapped by inertia. You've got it inside, it's mixed into a complex business, you don't move as fast as specialists do, and you fall behind. And so, surprisingly often, when you take the 8 here and the 2 here and put them inside one company, you end up with less than 10. Now, there are some cases for green. It's not simply combining profits. That continues to be red. If you're company at stage 2 and you buy stage 1, company has value of 8, company at stage 1 has value of 8, you buy it, you're going to have to pay at least 8 for it. In fact, you're probably going to have to pay more. And that's just so even if you only have to pay 8, you're just moving these profits and putting from one pocket and putting them into another pocket. So simply buying is not going to change the total profit. Occasionally, this is point 1 in the green, you can get some additional monopoly power. You can get market power. But it's a really rare case. And I won't go into the technicalities of it, but it basically boils down to elasticity being higher here than it is there. And you'll talk about elasticities when you talk about economics with Doug a few terms from now. But just sort of take it from me at this point that you can rarely get extra profits by creating monopoly power vertically. You can do that horizontally by consolidating a market horizontally, but it's really rare to be able to do it vertically. The big potential for creating extra value through vertical integration comes really in much along the line of the discussion we had a few moments ago about VCI. When there's complex relationships between these stages, sometimes when there's a new market, when there's either no independence or weak independence, and the only way you can develop the market is to bring the skills internally and build on them, and or if the independents simply lack the money to be able to develop things or the knowledge to be able to do that. So if you can make the case, there's a complex relationship at that interface, or the companies down here are just really weak, or maybe barely even exist, so there may be a case to bring them inside so that you can develop the market, develop the product. Then there's a case for vertical integration. Now, that case doesn't necessarily last forever. And there's often an evolution in which you go from integrated as you develop the market and figure out the interfaces. And then once that knowledge diffuses and becomes understood across the market, you start spinning off pieces and go back to specialized firms. So again, there's often a case, at least sometimes a case, for doing things internally because of complexity, because of specialized knowledge, because of creating new markets. But over time, that knowledge diffuses, and it often makes sense to spin it back out again. Now I just want to quickly reinforce the points around the key points around what you need to be able to do to coordinate and run an effective value chain integration strategy, and for that matter, run an effective value chain partner strategy. And as always, it starts with customer vision. Having a really clear sense of what the customers want. In the value chain integrator case, the end market, the value chain partner strategy case, what your VCI needs. So a really strong sense of the customer. Then really good ability to assess risk, so that you don't get trapped in things that are going to turn out to have real problems. And this is where some of the scenario building strategies that we use the spreadsheets for can help a lot. Then the ability to be flexible, to do variable costs rather than fixed costs when you face a lot of uncertainty. Think a lot. This thing is driving itself. I'm having to push it back. To be able to optimize inventory, to be able to balance supply and demand, and these ideas I'm stealing from IBM from some work they did a few years ago. But the basic point around flexibility is absolutely core. Then to be able to understand the system, to understand not just the individual relationships you have, not just your part of it, what you do, what each of your suppliers do, and how they all fit together, what each of your partner does, and how they all fit together, to really understand the system and to be able to manage it as a system. And finally, to be visible. As the VCI and even as the VCP, you've got to be recognized as the leader. Apple is highly visible. Foxconn is highly visible. A Pfizer or a Glaxo are highly visible. Everybody in the industry knows them. Everybody in the customer base knows them. Certainly the VCIs, the customers base. The customers don't always know the VCPs, the end market customers, but certainly the potential value chain integrators that would work with the VCPs know them. So every consumer electronics company knows Foxconn. So highly visible as the leader in this in the value chain. Now I want to spend a few minutes on what happens when you don't manage the value chain very well. And here's an example from a few years ago in Kunshan City in China, where you had a dust storm that blew up. In August 2014, General Motors said that it has no immediate plans to review how it manages the safety standards further down its supply chain. This is 3 days after a blast at a supplier's contractor in China. And GM just said, that's a supplier, it's not our responsibility. And leaving aside the ethics of it, which I think are huge, there's also simply the supply chain disruption, the cost of supply chain disruption. So if you leave your suppliers alone and you end up with problems, that affects your ability to deliver products to customers. So you put together both the ethical issues of not taking some responsibility for working conditions and plant conditions, and the end market for customers. This is a huge problem. The company's president said, the automaker, we will continue the prevailing practice in which car makers rely on their direct component suppliers to monitor the safety standards of indirect suppliers further down the chain. It's not our responsibility. Ethically and in terms of continuous supply, that raises big issues. Come forward a year or so, we're into what I'll call the shrapnel shooting airbags from a company called Takata. And some of us may remember, especially Honda, but also Subaru, Mazda, some others, having cars that had airbags in them that when they blew up, shot out what amounts to shrapnel and killed multiple people. This is a failure in Honda's case, in Subaru's case, in Mazda's case, especially Honda, to not work effectively with Takata to make sure that the supply was reliable. Then the battery fires that we talked about briefly in class with Samsung and the Note 7. huge problems when it changed the design and didn't manage its suppliers, both Samsung SDI and Amperex, an internal supplier and an external supplier, and ran into big problems as a result of not managing the supply chain effectively. Those of us who spend time in Toronto may be familiar with Bombardier and the fact that Bombardier has struggled for years to deliver its streetcars on time. Huge problems in its supply chain, in its own assembly facilities, and in the suppliers that deliver it to it. And to the point that not only has it had problems in Toronto, but it has lost contracts in Chicago in competition with a company from China that a contract that it historically would have expected to get, and then a contract in New York that it wasn't even allowed to bid on because New York just simply didn't trust it to be able to deliver effectively. So you don't manage effectively, you have problems with existing customers, and you lose opportunities to get new customers. In 2016, it lost the $1.3 billion bid in Chicago. 2017, it wasn't allowed to bid in New York. 2017, Metrolinx in Ontario cut its order from 182 units to 76 units and shifted to Alstom in France. And so this is a Canadian buyer refusing to buy from a Canadian seller because it just frankly didn't trust it. And then January 2018 at JFK at the airport. There we've got the landlord, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and the airline and contractors, and you get this huge mass of people not being able to being stuck on airplanes and stuck in the terminals because each of the operators in each of the individual terminals runs on its own bottom, runs independently, even though they're all contracting with the Port Authority, and weren't balancing customers from terminal to terminal because they're each trying to look out for their own airlines when there were weather delays. And there were lots of opportunities to rebalance and shift people from runway to runway and terminal to terminal, and each of the terminal operators refused to do it. And the Port Authority, which is the landlord and should have had value chain responsibility, didn't do it, didn't manage it. So, huge upside to value chain integration strategy, and when you blow it, huge problems, both ethical problems and market problems. So I'll end here with this slide. And I want to think about there's the VCI connected to the VCPs, which in turn typically are connected to a bunch of peripheral firms. And there's this hierarchy of value capture that we talked about in class. Typically the value chain integrators, the VCIs, make the most money. Value chain partners often make a fair bit and are reasonably stable. The peripheral firms are the ones that really struggle both to maintain profits and even to survive as they get shaken in and shaken out of individual contracts and individual generations of products. And there's a hierarchy of strategic challenge. Value chain integration is a hard strategy. It's a really demanding strategy. You need to know what parts of the value chain to be part of. You need to know what parts to do internally. You need to know what parts to do with partners. That's the configuration issue. You need to know how to coordinate and be really good at coordinating individual partners, individual suppliers, the portfolio of suppliers, coordinate your own portfolio of suppliers, coordinate your suppliers, be willing to step in and step over your value chain partner, step over your supplier if need be. These are incredibly demanding skills. As a result, they're VRIN. When you can do them well, they're valuable, they're rare, they're inimitable, they're non-substitutable. They generate massive competitive advantage and really contribute to profitability. Value chain partner is tough also. Not as overall tough typically because you're not managing the overall value chain. You're not fully responsible for the vision of value for end markets, but it's tough. But this should be our minimum goal. Settling for being a peripheral firm is easier, but it's also the shortest term. The likelihood of getting shaken out is really high. So understanding the value chain, looking for opportunities to step in and be a partner, ideally for multiple value chains or at least multiple to multiple VCIs, should be our minimum goal in strategy. So learn how to do BBB, learn how to do build, borrow, and buy, learn how to put that together into a value chain strategy. If you can as an integrator, if not as a partner, trying to get out of the peripheral positions as quickly as we can. Happy to talk about this online, happy to talk about this when we get back together again, and look forward to seeing you soon.